Welcome to today's Explainer. Let's just dive right into it, shall we? We constantly hear about the legendary toughness of the military. The ability to push through grueling, seemingly impossible conditions is literally a hallmark of those who serve. But recently, a really fascinating and honestly deeply concerning debate has erupted over exactly where we draw the line. Where is the boundary between an honorable, necessary endurance of hardship and something entirely different, like systemic, bureaucratic neglect? Today, we're going to unpack this tension. We'll look at a real-time crisis that's been unfolding in the United States Navy and break down the complex psychological and cultural forces behind it all.
Over 250. Let that sink in for a second. That represents the number of consecutive days the USS Abraham Lincoln spent at sea in the Middle East without a single significant port visit. Think about that. We're talking about a massive Nimitz-class aircraft carrier carrying roughly 5,000 sailors and Marines. This is an extreme record for the modern era, and it has absolutely pushed the crew to a breaking point, sparking a massive debate about how we actually treat our service members.
So here is our roadmap for today. 1. The carrier deployment crisis. 2. The military ethos. 3. Embracing the suck. 4. Endurance versus systemic neglect. And finally 5. The psychological toll.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the carrier deployment crisis.
So, as this deployment dragged on indefinitely, the conditions reported aboard the Lincoln severely degraded. We're talking about a complete breakdown of basic everyday infrastructure. Lawmakers and family members have documented some pretty harsh realities. Mold-infested showers, toilets that simply refuse to work, completely broken washing machines, and pretty much zero consistent hot water. On top of that, supply chain disruptions meant the ship's store actually ran out of basic hygiene products. No soap, no toothpaste, even the food had to be heavily rationed. Imagine being confined to a floating steel city where the most basic amenities of human dignity just stop functioning for months on end.
And look, this isn't just some isolated incident or a string of bad luck. There is a clear, systemic trend happening right now in the modern Navy. Just look at the numbers. The USS Gerald R. Ford spent 260 days at sea in 2024, and then an astonishing 326 days in 2025. The Eisenhower hit 274 days. To put that into perspective, the traditional target for a deployment is around 210 days, and that usually includes regular port visits for some much-needed rest. Instead, these massive ships are being utilized for continuous deterrence and combat ops without any relief. That places an immense strain, not just on the hardware of the ships themselves, but on the human beings operating them.
And that human strain, it is profound. Listen to this quote from a crew member on the Lincoln. It really captures the sheer exhaustion and uncertainty these sailors are dealing with. The psychological burden of an indefinite deployment, waking up every single day hoping for an end date that just never seems to materialize. That completely compounds the physical stress of those deteriorating living conditions we just talked about.
Moving right along to Section 2, the military ethos.
Now, there is a really profound tension here. Historically, maritime life was brutal. It meant wet, freezing environments, subsisting on moldy bread and stale water, and being completely cut off from the rest of the world. But today, multi-billion-dollar warships come with expectations of modern amenities, internet access, and something at least remotely resembling civilian living standards. But traditionalists will argue that the primary purpose of a warship is combat lethality, not domestic comfort.
And this sentiment is perfectly encapsulated by one military veteran's response to the news about the USS Lincoln. There's a very vocal segment of the military community that feels complaints about broken toilets and long deployments completely miss the point of military service. From this perspective, war is inherently miserable, right? And physical conditioning through hardship is absolutely essential for combat readiness. To them, expecting comfort is often viewed as a sign of weakness.
Which brings us to Section 3, embracing the suck.
Embrace the suck. If you know anyone in the military, you've probably heard this. It's a central virtue in military life. It's all about demonstrating mental strength by accepting the horrible, miserable things that you simply cannot change. It's not just a bumper sticker catchphrase, guys. It's practically a mechanism for survival. Shared adversity, basically suffering together, is proven to accelerate group cohesion and build intense, unbreakable mutual trust.
And honestly, this isn't even a new concept. Embracing the suck has deep, deep roots in ancient Stoic philosophy. Thinkers like Epictetus taught that while we can't control our circumstances, we absolutely control our reaction to them. This exact philosophy is what famously helped Vice Admiral James Stockdale survive years of brutal captivity and torture in North Vietnam. The ability to keep your spirit alive amidst uncontrollable hardship is just a profound, necessary military virtue.
Let's dive into Section 4, Endurance versus Systemic Neglect. To really explain this, we turn to a brilliant metaphor from a U.S. Army War College publication. It's called the bad beer metaphor. The author describes these young officers who continually drink and pay for terrible-tasting beer just to prove they're tough enough to handle it. The whole point is this: mindlessly embracing the suck is not actually a virtue if the suffering is pointless. If military leaders just accept nonsensical decisions and logistical failures under the guise of being tough, they aren't building resilience. They're actually breeding mediocrity and demonstrating terrible judgment.
We absolutely have to separate necessary combat austerity from systemic neglect. Now think about Army soldiers deployed to a combat zone. They're routinely enduring mud, rain, eating MREs, getting very little sleep, maybe dealing with snakes and scorpions out in the desert. They rarely complain to the media, and the public generally accepts this as an ordinary part of being a soldier. That austerity is a tactical necessity driven by a hostile environment. But when sailors on a warship, one that isn't actively taking fire, report roaches, dirty bathrooms, or intermittent clean water, well, it gets a lot more attention. It's easier to document, and it's much easier to frame as a failure of leadership. Sometimes news coverage takes a legitimate quality-of-life concern and turns it into a political controversy without really explaining that different branches just operate under vastly different conditions. But, and this is a big but, unsafe water and unsanitary facilities need to be fixed wherever they occur. Because accepting the natural hardships of military service definitely does not mean accepting entirely preventable health risks.
The sociological impact of this difference is just massive. When soldiers suffer together against an enemy, it builds what we call horizontal cohesion. They bond incredibly intensely with their peers. But when sailors suffer because their own institution failed to fix the laundry machines or route supply ships for 9 months, that creates vertical alienation. They don't blame the enemy, they feel entirely abandoned by their own leadership.
And that leads us straight into Section 5, the psychological toll.
Make no mistake, the costs here are severe. When troops perceive their hardship as just administrative indifference rather than actual combat necessity, it completely fractures trust. It destroys their sense of belonging to the institution. And what happens? High-quality talent simply packs up and leaves the military. On the USS Abraham Lincoln, this relentless, seemingly pointless environmental stress, combined with those indefinite extensions we talked about earlier, led to a breakdown in combat readiness, profoundly low morale, and a truly overwhelming psychological toll.
Now, the military actively tries to build resilience against this strain by tapping into military culture itself. There's something called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, and it proves highly effective for service members. It focuses on accepting unavoidable distress while still taking actions that align with your core values. Essentially, it's the healthy psychological application of embracing the suck, using that innate toughness to navigate exhaustion and adversity.
But look, therapy can only fix so much if the environment itself remains broken. This quote right here from retired Navy Rear Admiral Nancy LaCour perfectly synthesizes the entire issue. Yes, the sailors are incredibly tough. They have proven over and over they can embrace the suck. But the institution cannot weaponize that resilience to cover up its own logistical failures or just endlessly extend deployments without providing the necessary support.
Which leaves us with the ultimate question for today. Where exactly is the line between necessary duty and systemic neglect? As warfare continues to evolve and the demands on our forces inevitably increase, distinguishing between building tough warriors and actively neglecting them will define not just the future readiness, but the moral compass of the military itself. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope breaking this down helped you grasp the incredible complexities hiding behind the headlines. Keep asking those tough questions, and I'll catch you next time.